traveling to China. The plane descended through a gauzy haze of clouds, and as the wheels kissed the tarmac at Beijing Capital International Airport, a jolt of disbelief struck me. I was really here. After years of vague and late-night travel plans scribbled in notebooks, I was standing at the threshold of a country that had always felt larger than life. China, in 2025, was not the China of the past or even of last year. It shimmered between ancient and future, tradition and innovation, a place where the shadows of dynasties whispered behind LED-lit skyscrapers. As I seen into the wide, humming corridors of Terminal 3, everything felt charged with electricity. The airport was a marvel of efficiency. Robots whirred past with luggage carts, digital signs floated in midair with holographic clarity, and facial recognition sped up the customs process in a way that felt both convenient and a little unsatisfying. Within 30 minutes of landing, I was out in the sunlight, squinting at the scale of everything. Beijing's skyline in the distance looked like a jagged row of teeth biting into the morning sky. I checked into a boutique hotel tucked away in a quiet hutong near Nanluogu Xi'an. The alleyways, narrow and labyrinthine, were alive with bicycles, the smell of fresh jianbing from street vendors, and the low murmur of conversations behind gray brick. The hotel itself was a renovated Xi'an, an old courtyard home, with modern minimalist interiors, bamboo plants in every corner, and a rooftop that gave a surprising view of the city beyond. The next morning, jet lag nudging me out of sleep before sunrise, I set off for the Forbidden City. The streets were beginning to stir as I made my way by bike share through the early fog. I stopped at a small tea shop, sipping hot jasmine tea from a paper cup while watching the city. Beijing was a city that didn't just rise with the sun. It seemed to thrum with an undercurrent of motion even in the quietest hours. Arriving at the Forbidden City was like stepping through a time portal. Despite the tech upgrades, smart wristbands for self-guided tours, interactive AR displays overlaying historical events as you moved from hall to hall, the spirit of the place hadn't changed. The wide courtyards, the vermilion gates, the golden roof tiles all still radiated the same imperial grandeur. I spent hours wandering its vastness, imagining the weight of silence in the days of emperors. I could almost hear the clack of embroidered stone, the rustle of silk robes in the wind. Later that day, I ventured to Jingshan Park. At the top of the hill, Beijing stretched out before me, orderly yet chaotic, gray but vibrant. A group of elderly locals danced in coordinated movements to soft music from a speaker, while others did Tai Chi. I watched them, charmed by the way the past seemed to live quietly, persistently in the rhythm of daily life. By the third day, I was on a bullet train heading south. The speed was unreal, over 350 km/h, and yet the ride was smooth, almost silent. The countryside blurred by, neat rows of green farmland, mist-covered mountains, flash of villages nestled in valleys. I was on my way to Xi'an, the ancient capital and home to the terracotta warriors. Xi'an was different from Beijing, more compact, grittier in parts, but rich with history. I rented an e-scooter and zipped along the city wall, stopping to admire the contrast between the traditional watchtowers and the rising skyline beyond. When I finally made it to the terracotta army site, the sheer scale of the excavation left me breathless. Thousands of soldiers, horses, and chariots stood in silent formation, frozen mid-march for 2 millennia. It was a powerful reminder of how runs here, how emperors thought in dynasties, not decades. That night, I found myself wandering the Muslim quarter. The food was outrageous. Lamb skewers grilled over open flame, rugiamo stuffed with cumin-scented meat, noodles stretched and slapped into perfect ribbons before my eyes. Lanterns swung overhead as vendors called out in a mixture of Mandarin and local dialects, and the whole place buzzed with energy. I met a fellow traveler from Chengdu, who introduced me to a fermented rice wine stall. We clinked cups under a canopy of red silk and swapped stories late into the Chengdu was my next destination, and the draw was obvious: pandas. But the city had more than just its iconic bears. The rhythm here was slower, more relaxed. Tea houses lined the riverbanks, and locals played mahjong in the parks under dappled sun. I visited the Chengdu research base of giant panda breeding early in the morning to beat the crowds and watch the pandas roll, tumble, and lazily munch on bamboo. It was heart-melting. In the evening, I walked through the wide and narrow alleys, where historic architecture met hip cafes and art galleries. Young couples posed for selfies in hanfu, traditional Chinese clothing that had made a fashionable comeback. I stopped to try a spicy hot pot, choosing ingredients from a conveyor belt and dropping them into a bubbling cauldron of Sichuan peppercorn-laced broth. My tongue went numb in seconds, but I couldn't stop eating. I decided to go west to see the edge of the Gobi Desert in Dunhuang. Flying in over endless sands felt like approaching another planet. The town was small but had a magnetic low-slung houses, camel statues at roundabouts, and the deep red cliffs and dunes looming in the background. I booked a sunset camel ride, and as the light turned the dunes to fire, I felt a strange hush settle over me. The desert had a voice of its own, a low, wind-driven hum that spoke of caravans and lost travelers, of silk routes and ancient. At the Mogao Caves, I walked among thousands of Buddhist murals, marveling at the artistry and preservation. My guide, a soft-spoken art history student, told me stories of monks and patrons, of desert monks painting their devotion into rock, and the darkness inside those caves felt alive, sacred. More of China called me east again, toward Shanghai. The train from Dunhuang was long, but I didn't mind. I watched the landscape shift from desert to steppe to farmland, dozing off with the rhythmic clatter of steel on rail beneath. When I arrived in Shanghai, the neon lights felt like a punch to the senses. Skyscrapers blinked in sync along the Bund, each building taller than the last, and I could feel the pulse of the global city in every crowded metro car and every glass tower. I spent an afternoon wandering the French concession, admiring sycamore-lined streets and Art Deco buildings, sipping espresso in a cafe that could have been in Paris. Then I dove headfirst into the madness of Nanjing Road, dodging crowds, sheer audacity of retail here, massive flagship stores, holographic ads, drone-delivered bubble tea. I visited the Shanghai Tower's observation deck and stared out over the Huangpu River, blinking down at the ships below. The scale of it all was almost too much to take in. But it was Hangzhou that gave me my breath back. Just an hour by train, it felt like another world. West Lake shimmered beneath weeping willows and wooden bridges. I rented a bike and circled the lake, stopping at temples and tea. At Longjing village, I sat with a farmer who let me taste his harvest. The tea was delicate, grassy, and the quiet of the hills was a balm after the high-frequency buzz of Shanghai. Toward the end of my journey, I flew down to Guilin and took a boat along the Li River to Yangshuo. The karst mountains rose like dragon spines from the earth, cloaked in mist. Fishermen glided by on bamboo rafts, cormorants perched beside them, in a small inn surrounded by rice fields, and spent my days hiking, biking, and doing absolutely nothing when the moment called for it. There was something about those last few days in the countryside that grounded the whole trip. I thought about the Great Wall, which I'd visited on a cold, blustery morning, how it twisted over the mountains like a spine, how walking along it felt like stepping outside of. I thought about the pandas in Chengdu, the steaming dumplings in Xi'an, the sheer vertical madness of Shanghai, and the whispering sand dunes of Dunhuang. China in 2025 had been so much more than I imagined. It wasn't just the temples or the tech, the food or the history. It was the contrasts that made it unforgettable. The monks with smartphones, the dancers in ancient robes performing beside digital screens, the tea brewed with centuries-old tradition in cafes where drones buzzed overhead. It was a place constantly becoming, endlessly. As I boarded my flight home, I didn't feel like I was leaving something behind. I felt like I was carrying it with me. The sounds, the tastes, the vastness, the stillness. I closed my eyes and saw a red lantern swaying in the dusk, a mountain wrapped in mist, sizzling walks and laughter. And I knew I'd be back.